and welcome to another segment of the Coatesville Area Public Library's Oral History Project. I'm your host, Kirk Witmer, and with me today is a 96-year-old Chester Countyan. Please welcome John Johnson. John, it's nice to have you with us today.
Okay.
John, you were born in the southern part of the county, I think
That's
you
right.
mentioned. Tell me about life down there as a young boy.
Well, I lived down in the southern part of Chester County, along the old Newport Pike. The house is not standing any longer where I was born, but we lived in that area near Avondale. My father went to market in Wilmington, curb market in Wilmington.
Mm-hmm. What was he selling?
He was selling farm products, you know, chickens, eggs, farm products.
Mm-hmm.
People would bring things to his house and he would take them down there. Of course, he drove a horse and wagon. That's back in the early 1900s, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where I lived at first.
Now, I'm sure as a young boy living on a farm, you must have had some assignments that
Well-
were given to you.
Well, I can't remember too much from that area. When I was still a young boy, my father bought a farm west of Cochranville.
Mm-hmm.
So we lived up there on that farm for between Cochranville and Homeville, on what they call the Homeville Road. So we lived there for a few years, and I can remember working on as a boy working on the farm, helping bring hay in. When in those days we had to pitch the hay with a pitchfork, you know.
Yes.
Pitch the fork up on hay up on the wagon, and I got up on the wagon and helped to scatter it around and tramp it down.
Mm-hmm.
So when we left there, we bought a farm over 4 miles south of Downingtown. And from there I went to a one-room schoolhouse over on the Marshall and Thorndale Road. And it was called Shady Side School. Well, after we finished, of course, it was a one-room school where the teacher taught all 8 grades.
Mm.
There were about anywhere from 15 to 30 students in a one-room school. So,
What was discipline like?
Huh?
What was discipline like in that one-room schoolhouse?
well, there was a heater in the back corner of the room, you know,
Mm-hmm.
and the teacher had to make sure that the fire was going. The teacher in those days usually lived at a neighboring farm, and she would go early in the morning and get the fire started, you know. And there was a little platform in the front of the school, and the teacher's desk sat up on that platform. And she would talk to students from there, and as we went up front in each grade, she asked us questions, and that's how we got through the 8th grade. Well, after going to Downingtown to that school, I went drove a horse and wagon 4 miles over the hills to Downingtown High School.
So horses were still the major mode of transportation
That's right.
at that time.
I drove a horse and wagon over there. Well, anyhow, the school was small at that day. That school is no longer standing either. The Lutheran church standing there now where the high school used to stand in Downingtown.
Mm-hmm.
So, in those days, the transportation was either horse and wagon. Was some kids from up in the other part of Chester County came down to Downingtown, and I went over. The trolley line was still running from Westchester to Coatesville, went through Downingtown, and some few students would come in on that trolley line. There was also a railroad running up along the east branch of the Brandywine from Downingtown up to Glenmore and across country, and it went through Honeybrook, very close to where I'm living now up at Heatherwood, and from there on into Lancaster. Well, the railroad, of course, is long gone, but the track is still in use from Lancaster out to New Holland to service a New Holland Machine Company and a concrete business in New Holland. Well, when we were through high school, we went to 28 in our graduating class.
28
28.
in your high school graduating class. Amazing.
We went to Washington. I think we spent about 3 days down in Washington. There were 2 teachers went with us as chaperones. Miss Marion Phillips was our history teacher. She went. And our math teacher went along. He was also the athletic coach there. He went along. So we went to Washington Monument, and I remember another boy and I walked all the way up the top of Washington Monument, which you're not allowed to do today. Now, by the way, Washington Monument is now being conditioned both inside and out. There is a scaffold all the way up to the top of it. The Washington Monument is now 555 feet high, with a foundation of 45 feet in the ground. Well, from Washington Monument, then we went, the next place we visited, I remember, was the Bureau of Printing and Engraving, where we saw them printing paper money. And I asked what the largest paper money was that they printed that day, and the guy that took us through said, "Just step aside, I'll show you the largest paper money." So he took me in a little room and showed me a larger engraving of a $10,000 bill.
Wow.
Well, from there then we went to the White House and went through just a small portion of the White House. Calvin Coolidge was president at that time. He stood out in the hallway and shook hands with each one of us as we went by, which of course you can't imagine a president doing that today.
No, that had to be the high point of a senior trip, wasn't it?
That's yeah.
Well, John, you eventually went off to college. Tell us about your college years.
Well, I went up to Penn State. I was in the class of 24 in Downingtown. I went up to Penn State and was in the class of 1928 in Penn State. Well, at that time, the total enrollment at Penn State was about 4,000. Now the enrollment at on the campus is about 27,000. The total enrollment at Penn State, with all the satellite schools they have scattered around over the state, was about 80,000 total. So, of course, I was I didn't play in the athletics. I was interested in hiking. We did a lot of hiking around through the mountains up there. Belongs to a hiking club, you know.
What was your field of study? What field of study?
I studied mechanical engineering up there.
In hopes of coming back and getting a job at Lucan's?
Well, I didn't know what I was going to do. We were interviewed somewhat up there by people, but fortunately, when I came back to live, my mother then lived in Thorndale.
What were job prospects for a young man in the 1920s?
It wasn't very good. You know what the wages were for college students generally? $125 a month.
Oh, my.
So anyhow, my father, in a way, was sort of instrumental in getting me a job at Lucan's. Well, it so happened that the chief engineer at Lucan's was also a Penn State graduate in the class of 1901. So I went to work at Lucan's, and I worked in engineering for a number of years, general engineering, or maintenance engineering, as we used to call it. And then I was asked to transfer to another engineering division called the die design, where we designed dies for making various shapes. And in that area we had presses that would press heavy metal objects. We cut plates into various shapes. We rolled cylinders. We pressed heads. The heaviest head I remember we ever pressed there was 8 3/4 inches thick. Now that was a big, thick chunk of steel they put in there at a flat piece, and then press it into a heads, which was used pretty much in the nuclear work. So I worked there for 40 years and resigned or retired in 1968.
So you've had a long career with Lukens. Can you remember your beginning and ending salaries?
Well, I can't tell you. I can tell you what my original salary was, $125 a month.
Wow.
I don't remember exactly what my ending salary was, but it wasn't anything like it is today.
John, you've had a long-standing career in association with the Boy Scouts of America.
Yeah.
Tell us about your association with
Well, in 1929, shortly after I went to work at Lukens, a man who was principal of school down at Thorndale School at that time came up and asked me if I'd like to come down and help him with the Boy Scout troop. That was 1929. Well, he made me his assistant scoutmaster at that time. Well, it went on, I think about 1932. In those days, you know, you didn't have to have a college diploma to teach school. So he went back over to Westchester, it's called the Westchester State Normal School at that time, and finished and got a certificate so he could continue teaching. Well, I took the scout troop over then. So I was scoutmaster then for a few years. So after that, I was asked to become a district commissioner. So I took the job of district commissioner for several years.
In which district? In what district?
What they call the Brandywine district at that time.
Now give us an idea of exactly the parameters of the Brandywine district.
Well, Brandywine run up around Cockerville, Downingtown, Honeybrook, as far up as Elverson, northern part of the county. And as I told you coming over, I helped to install a scout troop over at the Downingtown Industrial School. Anyhow, that's where, so, of course, Camp Horseshoe opened up in 1928. And our scouts would go down to Horseshoe for camping in the summer, usually 1 or 2 weeks, you know, each troop. So I went down there a few times, camped with the boys down. Well, then sometime in the wintertime, we'd go down for a winter camp. Of course, we didn't camp out in the camp. We stayed in the buildings down there that were fitted for winter camping. We cooked our own meals, took our food along, cooked our own meals and so forth.
I've stayed in a few of those buildings myself. I've stayed in a few of those buildings myself.
Anyhow, after I was asked, later after district commissioner, I was asked to take charge of organization. At that time, then we organized new troops and, of course, cub packs. And the older boys had another unit, but it wasn't quite as popular as the Boy Scout unit. So anyhow, we had the older scouts.
It sounds to me, John, like scouting came to you late in life. You were never a Boy Scout as a boy, but you certainly seem to have enjoyed scouting as an adult.
Yeah. Well, I like working, and I don't know how my wife ever put up with me away as much as I was, you know. Over the weekends, we'd go camping, you know, in different places. And in 1950, I got the Silver Beaver in 1948.
Give us a little background on what it takes to get a Silver Beaver award.
Well, the Silver Beaver, you have to be recognized as a scout leader with some qualifications suitable to taking care of the boys and all the program that they have to follow, you know. And you're not interviewed for this. You don't know you're going to get the Silver Beaver until it's presented to you, which shown on the pictures that we took there. So they read what they found out about you as an individual, you know. A little bit of your family history and your education and what you do is, what your occupation is and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
So then they write this up and it's read, and you don't know until it's read that you're going to be selected as a recipient of the Silver Beaver Award.
Now, John, we have a picture here of the night that you received your Silver Beaver Award. Who is that in the picture shaking hands with you?
The man shaking hands with me is Justice Owen J. Roberts of the United States Supreme Court.
Okay, and how is it that he was on the occasion here to give you your Silver
He
Beaver?
was a speaker at the annual meeting of the Boy Scouts at that time,
Mm-hmm.
1948.
Now, you mentioned that he was a local here in our area, did you not?
Justice Roberts had a farm up in the northern part of Chester County, not too far from Elverson, up in that area. And he invited a few of us up one time, one Saturday afternoon, to come up and just sit around and chat with him a while. So we sat out in his yard in the grass and talked to Justice Roberts. So it was a privilege to know Justice Owen J. Roberts.
John, with your association in scouting over so many years, I'm sure you've attended some jamborees. What are your memories of Boy Scout jamborees?
Well, I went to California by train. There were 2 scout troops from Chester County went over.
Okay, and what year was this?
This is 1953.
Mm-hmm.
Anyhow, we went to California to the National Jamboree. It was held on Irvine Ranch, south of Los Angeles. The Irvine Ranch at that time was several thousand acres owned by a family by the name of Irvine. And at that time, there was grass all over that area, about 30 inches high, that before we could build a fire for our cooking, we had to dig a circle 12 feet in diameter and take all the grass off, even take the roots of the grass out so that it couldn't set fire.
Couldn't start a grass fire.
If it had ever set fire, it would just wipe the whole jamboree group out. So anyhow, but on the way out, if I can tell a little bit about our experiences on the way out, we went by train, and they were before the days of the local air conditioning cars. So the air conditioning was done as we pulled into some of the stations along the way. They'd bring big loads of 100-pound chunks of ice out, open the door and slide the ice into the compartments for the ice, and that's the way the cars were cooled. We stopped in Chicago and went through the Chicago Zoo there on the way. Then we stopped at Denver, Colorado, called the Mile High City, and we spent a day or so there, and we went out to a copper mine to see how they mined copper in those days. Well, copper mining is open mining. So we saw how they dug down, and then they enlarged it and dug down some more, and sort of step formations, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So we saw how they were mining copper. Well, then, after we left there, we went to Salt Lake City, and we went to Salt Lake City, and of course we saw the tabernacle there, where the tabernacle chorus sings, you know. Anyhow, while we were at Salt Lake City, we were told to take a dip in the Salt Lake to prove that you can't sink, so salty. Well, at that time, we had a secretary at Coatesville called J.I. Hoffman, the YMCA. And J.I. usually went, in the summertime, he went out west, and he traveled, and he used to do like hiking in the mountains, you know, mountain climbing. Well, it so happened, when we came out of the lake to the bathhouse, Herbie Hoffman was standing on the platform there. And we didn't know he was there. He didn't know we were there.
So you meet a fellow Coatesvillian all the way out in Utah.
Huh?
You met a fellow Coatesvillian all the way in Utah.
That's right. Well, anyhow, well, then from there on, we went on to the Jamboree. And, well, after, of course, we were there 10 days at the Jamboree. And then on the way back, we stopped at the Grand Canyon, so we had a chance to see the Grand Canyon on the way back.
What are your impressions of the Grand Canyon? Share those with us.
Well, my impression of the Grand Canyon is something most unusual, and it is something that anybody who's in the area should see. Now they take people on trips down through the rapids. Well, it so happened that my stepson and his wife last year took one of those trips down over the rapids, and they got a big kick out of that. So Grand Canyon is really worth seeing.
John, I know that scouting's been a very important part of your life. It was a part of my life as a child growing up in Coatesville as well. Give us a little bit of the history of scouting and how it became important to us here in Coatesville.
Boy Scouting actually started in England. The story goes that there was a businessman from the United States in London. And he was, you know, London is a very, very foggy place. I've been in London, I know what it's like over there. But anyhow, this businessman was in London, and he had an engagement to meet with a businessman in London. And it was so foggy that day that he lost his way. And it so happened that a Boy Scout came by, and the scout said to him, "Can I help you?" He says, "You can help me because I'm lost. I have an engagement to meet with a businessman here in London, and I don't know how to find his place." Well, the Boy Scout said, "Well, I'll help you. If you tell me where to go, I'll tell you how to get there and take you there." So the Boy Scout led this man to go to the place where he wanted to go. Well, anyhow, this businessman from the United States was so impressed. This was in 1910. He was so impressed that when he got back to the United States, he began telling people how he was helped by a boy who called himself a Boy Scout. So as a result of his talking to people, they were able to organize the scout movement in the United States. The Chicago businessman, his name was William D. Boyce, and he's the man who actually was responsible for starting scouting here, because he came back and talked about the help he had from a Boy Scout in London. Now, there's considerably more to the history of scouting, but I am not enough familiar with it to actually enumerate years that had started. Now, Westchester, I believe, started somewhere around the late 1900s, 1919, somewhere along there. Well, as I said, I became involved in scouting in 1929. Well, it had been in progress then for approximately 10 years or so before I became involved in scouting. But it was through this Mr. Boyce from Chicago that scouting actually started in the United States.
John, you've talked about a number of scout troops that you have been associated with, and in fact even helped start some troops by yourself. Scouting was once very popular, and today it's not quite as prevalent as it once was. Do you have any opinions on what accounts for some of the demise of scouting in our country?
I don't know. There are some objections that they don't like part of the Scout Oath under God. You know, some people don't like that. I think there are so many activities these days for younger people that it has somewhat affected the Scout movement. However, Scouting is still a very large organization for both boys and adults, either Cubs or Scouts, or so that it is a very important organization. Now, Camp Horseshoe was started about 1928. There were some men who were interested in getting Camp Horseshoe started. There were McIlvains around Downingtown that were instrumental in getting Horseshoe started. Now, I knew 3 different McIlvains in the Downingtown area. They weren't all related, but their names were McIlvain. There was a Gilbert McIlvain who was a lumber dealer in Philadelphia. He was very much interested in scouting. There was a Don McIlvain who was scoutmaster of Troop 2. Pioli was Troop number 1, but Downingtown was Troop number 2, and Don McIlvain was scoutmaster there. Then there was a Gilbert McIlvain who was very much interested in scouting, who lived in Downingtown, and whenever there was camporees, he was always on hand, you know, whether we went camping or not. And one interesting thing I remember about Gilbert McIlvain, he always carried a large brass coffee pot with him. So when we went camping, he made sure that he had coffee on hand. Well, anyhow, that was interesting. Well, anyhow, when I was commissioner, one of my jobs was to go around and visit the various Scout troops we had in the area, which I did. And I'd go in and visit them during their meetings, you know, and that was quite interesting to listen to their program. These different scoutmasters run troops slightly different from what some did. Well, when I was scoutmaster, we met in the basement of the school in Thorndale, down there at the grade school in Thorndale. Then they moved over to the Methodist Church, and they're still meeting in Thorndale. Troop 70 is still meeting at the Methodist Church in Thorndale. But anyhow, that was my job as a commissioner, to go around and visit these various troops, which was quite interesting, you know. From Honeybrook to Downingtown to Elverson and different places. I remember being in Elverson one evening. There was an undertaker in Elverson who was a scoutmaster up there. And he kept the boys usually got out of the meeting around 9 o'clock in the evening. He kept these boys there 9:30, 10 o'clock. And finally I said to him, "Why are you keeping these boys here so late?" He said, "I'll tell you why. When they're here, I know what they're doing. When they're not here, I don't know what kind of mischief they may be getting into out in the town." So anyhow, I rather enjoyed visiting. Now, we used to have dinner meetings in order to get these various scout leaders to come out and take part in the program. Of course, we always had a training program along with our meeting, and we would ask the various troops to have a meal for us, which they did. They were volunteers to provide a meal for us. So we'd go and have a dinner, and we'd have our business meeting and whatever was necessary to take care of at that particular time. So that was an interesting part of this commissioner's job that I had. Well, then after the commissioner's job, I was asked to take the organization, which job consisted of helping to organize new troops and cub packs. So that was, I wasn't involved in that as long as I was a commissioner, but it was interesting going around to try to get troops organized. I can remember when troops got a little bit discouraged, or the scoutmaster got a little bit discouraged about things, and I think we just better give this scout troop up business. Well, I remember being a place in Thorndale one time when the troop down there was a little bit shaky. And one man said, I think we better give this scout troop, he was scoutmaster. And one of the other men who was on the committee down there, he gave quite a long dissertation about why they should not give the scout troop up, which they didn't. So Thorndale is quite a very active scout troop today, thanks to that particular man's suggestions back in that time.
John, our project here to create an oral history of Coatesville is, of course, funded by the Huston Charitable Trust. And you've mentioned to me that you've been associated with the Huston family over a number of years. Tell us about that.
Well, I knew, I'm familiar with the Huston family. There was, as far back as I remember, there were two brothers. A.F. that built Greystone. That was where he lived. He built that. And then there was C.L. Huston, his brother, who lived across the street in a stone house, not anywhere as near as elaborate as Greystone. But anyhow, A.F. was the businessman at Lucan's. He looked after finances. And C.L. was the millman. He would go down in the mill to make sure that everything was operating properly. The employees knew him quite well. They'd call him by name, and he'd call them by name. He was quite well known in the mills. Well, unfortunately, they tore his his home down. Had a president down there a number of years ago that wanted it down. He wanted an open space there between the Lucan's main office and Corinthia.
Terracina?
Sure. He wanted an open space there. Well, Skip Huston, whom I mentioned, he was the son of Charles L. Huston and his brother A.F. I mentioned. Well, Charles Huston had a son whose name was Charles Huston. And he was sort of pushed aside for a few years down there at Lucan's. And when he went to Ohio and got involved in the steel business in Ohio. But after they ironed out some little differences in the organization, C.L. Jr. came back to Coatesville, and he was named president of Lucan Steel at that time. Well, since that, they've had two or three different, since he left there, they had two or three different presidents there. Finally, the last president was instrumental in selling the business to Bethlehem Steel. So, but anyhow, C.L. Jr. had a son by the name, his name was Charles too, but everybody knows him by the name of Skip. Skip Huston is more or less looking after the Lucan's office building. As I understand, he's trying to develop offices in there, but I don't know how much progress he's made. I do know this, that Lucan's a few years ago spent a lot of money on that office building. They put all new plumbing in, all new electrical wiring, a new roof, and all new spouting around the outside of the building. They spent a lot of money on that building. So, but anyhow, Skip is sort of looking after the office project now.
John, you told me an interesting story about Ruth Huston earlier. Can you share that with us?
Oh, Ruth Huston was a sister of C.L. Huston Jr. And she spent most of her life doing evangelistic work, particularly the poor people in Kentucky where there was a camp down there that each summer she spent her summers there at the camp. She had a little double trailer. That was her summer home there, double trailer. And but she spent a lot of time there. And I told you on the way down that my wife and I did a lot of traveling around too. Particularly, we did some mission work too ourselves. But we stopped there at the camp where Miss Ruth Houston was, and she happened to be there the day we stopped there. So we met her. But anyhow, Miss Houston had a very nice home in Winter Park in Florida. And my wife and I used to go to Florida and spend part of the winters down there. So one day we went out for something to do to a lake where there was a man had a boat there that held about 12 or 14 people, and he, as you got on the boat, you know, until he filled up the boat, he'd look at you and say, "Well, now where are you from?" So when I told him we were from Coatesville, "Oh," he said, one of your neighbors is down on shore to show her where she lives when we go by." Well, it so happened there was a small canal about 6 or 8 feet wide that went from one lake to another. And this little boat went through the lake, one lake into the other. And it so happened as we were going through this lake, Miss Houston was standing out in her backyard. So this man who was operating the boat says, "Miss Houston, here's some folks from Coatesville." So we waved and she waved, but she didn't recognize because she was 50, 75 feet away from us maybe. So it so happened that winter, our minister at Coatesville was having they always invited people into an open house he had during a Christmas vacation. And many of the church members, of course, went over. They had refreshments, and it so happened that Miss Houston was there. She had come up to attend this. So as we went through, we met Miss Houston, and we said to her, "Miss Houston, we went through the canal down there in Winter Park, where your winter home is, and we waved to you, and you waved to us." "Oh," she said, "is that who you folks were? I never found out who went through there and waved to me." So that was Miss Houston. And another thing about Miss Houston, there's a Christian college called Bryan College down in Tennessee. And she was a trustee of that Bryan College, which I contribute some to today.
That's a very interesting story, John. You mentioned the minister having an open house. What minister, what church, and when was that?
Well, this was the Presbyterian Church of Coatesville at the corner of 4th Avenue and Lincoln Highway. Well, Dr. Evans, everybody called him Dr. Evans. His name was C. Hans Evans. He was at the Coatesville Church for 33 years. Well known in Coatesville. I think everybody knew Evans when he went out on the street. They speak to him and he spoke to them. He's a very friendly individual. So, but he was there for 33 years. His first wife died while he was there. Then he married a younger woman later on. It so happened that his father and mother, who lived in Philadelphia, came out there and lived in a house on Chestnut Street, almost back of the church. Mm-hmm. And they lived there for a few years until they both died. So, but Dr. Evans was a well-known man in Coatesville over the years, you know. He died in 1975, I believe it was. I'm not sure of that. But he was there for 33 years.
Well, John, you've certainly seen a lot of changes, bringing us from the days when horses were the primary mode of transportation up to some of the conditions that we're experiencing today. And I certainly want to thank you for taking your time to come out here and be a part of our oral history project.
Well, I appreciate the invitation. I mentioned that you have to be 96-year-old before somebody comes and wants to know something from you.
Well, we're very glad that we could get in touch with you and persuade you to come out and talk with us today, John, and I thank you again.
Well,